In the quaint village of Longbourn, nestled in the English countryside, news of great import had just arrived. Netherfield Park, the grand estate that had long stood empty, had at last been let to a Mr. Bingley, a wealthy young man from the north of England. The air in Longbourn crackled with excitement, like the first spark of a summer storm. Whispers darted from house to house, carried on the warm breeze that rustled through the lush gardens. The Bennet household, a modest yet charming residence, stood at the epicenter of this whirlwind of gossip and speculation. Inside, the drawing-room buzzed with an energy that seemed to make the very wallpaper quiver. Mrs. Bennet, a woman whose nerves were as finely tuned as a violin string, paced the floor. Her skirt swished with each turn, creating a rhythmic counterpoint to her rapid-fire thoughts. "Mr. Bennet," she called, her voice pitching high with urgency. "You must call on Mr. Bingley at once. Think of our girls." Mr. Bennet, ensconced in his favorite armchair, peered over his newspaper. His eyes twinkled with amusement, a stark contrast to his wife's frenetic energy. "And why, pray tell, must I do that, my dear?" he asked, his voice a calm eddy in the whirlpool of his wife's excitement. "Oh, you take delight in vexing me," Mrs. Bennet huffed, her cheeks flushing a deep pink. "You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." The 5 Bennet sisters, scattered about the room like wildflowers in a meadow, reacted to their mother's words with varying degrees of interest. Jane, the eldest and most beautiful, blushed softly, her gentle nature evident in her demure smile. Elizabeth, the second eldest, known for her quick wit and lively intelligence, caught her father's eye and suppressed a smile, a silent understanding passing between them. Mary, ever serious, barely looked up from her book of sermons, the pages rustling softly as she turned them. Kitty and Lydia, the 2 youngest, giggled and whispered excitedly, their heads bent close together like conspiring sparrows. As days passed, rumors about Mr. Bingley spread through the village like wildfire in a dry summer. His fortune, estimated at 4,000 or 5,000 a year, was discussed in hushed tones over steaming cups of tea and behind cupped hands in the local shops. The size of his party, the elegance of his carriage, even the cut of his coat became subjects of fervent speculation. The local community, starved for novelty, came alive with a flurry of activity. Ladies refreshed their wardrobes, the sound of scissors snipping through fabric echoing through parlors. Gentlemen polished their boots until they gleamed like mirrors, and invitations to dinners and card parties were issued with newfound enthusiasm. The upcoming Meryton assembly loomed large in everyone's minds, promising the first glimpse of the mysterious Mr. Bingley and his entourage. Mrs. Bennet's excitement grew with each passing day, her imagination painting vivid pictures of her daughters in wedding finery. She fluttered about the house like a restless butterfly, alternating between bouts of giddy anticipation and fretful worry. "Oh, Mr. Bennet," she lamented one evening, wringing her hands until they were red. "What if Mr. Bingley doesn't attend the assembly? What if he doesn't dance with our girls?" Mr. Bennet, his eyes twinkling with mischief, replied, "My dear, I'm sure if Mr. Bingley has any sense at all, he'll be utterly charmed by our daughters. Though perhaps we should warn him about your nerves." Elizabeth, overhearing this exchange from her perch by the window, stifled a laugh behind her hand, her eyes dancing with amusement. She loved her mother dearly but couldn't help finding humor in her dramatics. The golden light of the setting sun caught her profile, highlighting the intelligence and spirit that shone in her eyes. As the day of Mr. Bennet's visit to Netherfield approached, the tension in the Bennet household reached a fever pitch. The girls speculated endlessly about their potential new neighbor, each painting her own picture of the gentleman. "I imagine he's tall and handsome," sighed Lydia dreamily, twirling a lock of hair around her finger. "I hope he's fond of reading," mused Mary, adjusting her spectacles with a scholarly air. Jane, ever kind, simply said, "I'm sure he's a gentleman of good character," her voice as soft and sweet as a summer breeze. Elizabeth, watching her sisters with fond exasperation, added, "Let's not forget, we haven't even met the man yet. He could be a troll for all we know." Her words were met with a chorus of giggles and mock outrage. Finally, the day arrived when Mr. Bennet paid his visit to Netherfield. The house seemed to hold its breath as they awaited his return. When he finally stepped through the door, he was met with a barrage of questions from his wife and younger daughters. But true to his nature, he kept the details of the meeting to himself, his eyes twinkling with secret amusement as Mrs. Bennet's frustration grew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the anticipation in Longbourn had reached a crescendo. The Bennet family, along with the entire community, eagerly awaited their first glimpse of Mr. Bingley and his party at the upcoming Meryton assembly. The air was thick with possibility, and the promise of new beginnings hung like a shimmering veil over the village. Elizabeth stood by the window, her heart beating a quick rhythm against her ribs. As she gazed out at the darkening landscape, a strange feeling washed over her, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Little did she know that beyond the familiar fields and hedgerows, in the grand hall of the assembly rooms, a scene was about to unfold that would change her life forever. The grand hall of the assembly rooms pulsed with anticipation, a living, breathing entity of its own. Silk gowns rustled like whispers of secrets yet untold, while the low murmur of eager voices created a symphony of excitement. Candles flickered in ornate sconces, their warm glow casting dancing shadows across expectant faces. As the first notes of music swelled, all eyes turned to the entrance. Time seemed to slow as Mr. Bingley and his companions made their grand entrance. The young man himself was a vision of youthful charm, his golden hair catching the candlelight like a halo. His easy smile, as warm and inviting as a summer's day, immediately captivated the room. The knowledge of his 5,000 a year income only added to his allure, and many a young lady felt her heart skip a beat as he passed. Bingley moved through the crowd with a spring in his step, his genuine warmth and enthusiasm infectious. By his side, his sisters Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst provided a stark contrast. Their elaborate gowns and haughty expressions spoke volumes of their self-importance. Mr. Hurst, Caroline's husband, followed with the air of a man already bored with the proceedings, his gaze darting longingly towards the refreshment table. But it was the tall, dark figure of Mr. Darcy that truly commanded attention. He moved with the grace of a panther, each step deliberate and controlled. His chiseled features were set in an expression of cool indifference, a mask that only served to intrigue those around him. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a gentle breeze, carrying tales of his vast fortune, 10,000 a year, they said. Many a hopeful gaze followed his progress across the room, dreams of wealth and status dancing in their eyes. As the first dance began, Mr. Bingley wasted no time in seeking out a partner. His eyes lit upon Jane Bennet, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Jane's beauty was as delicate and enchanting as a spring blossom, her gentle demeanor a perfect complement to Bingley's exuberance. With a gallant bow that spoke of true gentility, he asked for her hand. Soon, they were twirling across the floor, lost in each other's eyes. The room seemed to fade away as they danced, and it was clear to all that a spark had been ignited, a flame that promised to burn bright. In stark contrast to his friend's enthusiasm, Mr. Darcy stood aloof at the edge of the room. His proud demeanor was a fortress against the hopeful glances cast his way, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. He refused all invitations to dance, his posture rigid and uninviting. Even when Bingley, flushed with joy after his second dance with Jane, suggested Elizabeth Bennet as a partner, Darcy's response was cutting. "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me," he said, his voice as cold as a winter's frost. The words carried across the room, striking Elizabeth like a physical blow. Her dark eyes, usually sparkling with wit and life, flashed with indignation. The sting of his dismissal was sharp, and she felt a surge of determination rise within her, a resolve to think ill of the proud Mr. Darcy, no matter his wealth or status. As the night wore on, the Bennet sisters experienced the ball in their own unique ways. Jane floated on air, her gentle heart captivated by Mr. Bingley's attentions. With each turn on the dance floor, her cheeks grew pinker, her smile more radiant. Elizabeth alternated between amusement at the foibles of her neighbors and irritation at Mr. Darcy's haughty behavior. Her quick wit found ample fodder in the evening's events, even as she nursed the wound to her pride. Mary, ever serious, stood on the sidelines, her fingers itching for the keys of a pianoforte. She longed for more intellectual conversation amidst what she perceived as frivolous frivolity. Kitty and Lydia, the youngest of the brood, flitted from one officer to another like butterflies in a garden. Their girlish laughter rose above the music, drawing both indulgent smiles and disapproving frowns from those around them. Mrs. Bennet, her face flushed with excitement and perhaps a touch too much wine, could not contain her joy at Jane's success. Her voice carried across the room like a trumpet, proclaiming her satisfaction with Bingley's interest in her eldest daughter. "Did you see how he singled out my Jane?" she crowed to anyone who would listen. "I dare say we'll have a wedding before the year is out." Elizabeth cringed, feeling the heat of embarrassment creep up her neck as she noticed the raised eyebrows and poorly concealed smirks of those nearby. She longed to quiet her mother, to preserve some dignity in the face of such blatant matchmaking. But Mrs. Bennet was unstoppable, her dreams of advantageous marriages for her daughters fueling her enthusiasm. As the final notes of the last dance faded away, the assembly began to disperse. The Bennet family gathered their shawls and reticules, each lost in their own thoughts about the evening's events. Jane's eyes shone with quiet happiness, while Elizabeth's brow furrowed as she replayed Mr. Darcy's slight in her mind. The younger girls chattered excitedly about the officers they had danced with, already planning their next social outing. The carriage ride home was filled with Mrs. Bennet's effusive praise for Mr. Bingley and his obvious partiality for Jane. Her sighs of contentment punctuated the night air, a stark contrast to the contemplative silence of her husband. Mr. Bennet listened with amused tolerance, his eyes twinkling with suppressed mirth at his wife's antics. As Longbourn came into view, a palpable sense of change hung in the air. Jane's potential match with Mr. Bingley held the promise of a brighter future, while the general dislike for the arrogant Mr. Darcy simmered beneath the surface. Elizabeth, her mind still churning with the events of the evening, gazed out the carriage window at the familiar landscape. Little did she know how these first impressions would shape the course of her life in the months to come. As they alighted from the carriage, the night air suddenly felt different, charged with possibility and the promise of things to come. Elizabeth paused on the threshold of Longbourn, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Something was shifting, changing, like the first tremors before an earthquake. The air hung heavy with moisture, mirroring the weight of Mrs. Bennet's anticipation, and Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to be irrevocably altered. The air hung heavy with moisture, mirroring the weight of Mrs. Bennet's anticipation. As Jane set off, dark clouds gathered overhead, their ominous presence promising a deluge. Mrs. Bennet pressed her nose against the cool windowpane, her breath fogging the glass as she watched her daughter's figure grow smaller in the distance. The first drops fell, tentative at first, then with increasing urgency. Soon, the countryside was drenched in sheets of rain, transforming the familiar landscape into a watercolor painting of grays and greens. Mrs. Bennet's lips curved into a smile of satisfaction, even as worry creased her brow. Hours ticked by with excruciating slowness. The Bennet household buzzed with nervous energy, each family member finding ways to occupy themselves while stealing glances at the door. When a letter finally arrived, hands scrambled to break the seal, eager eyes devouring its contents. The news confirmed Mrs. Bennet's expectations. Jane had fallen ill with a bad cold and was staying at Netherfield to recover. A mixture of concern and triumph danced across Mrs. Bennet's face as she relayed the news to her family. Elizabeth's heart clenched with worry for her beloved sister. Without a moment's hesitation, she decided to make the journey to Netherfield herself. The next morning dawned grey and misty as Elizabeth set out, her determined strides carrying her across 3 miles of muddy fields. The journey was arduous. Each step sank into the sodden earth, the hem of her dress growing heavier with mud. The wind whipped around her, tugging at her hair and clothes, as if nature itself was trying to impede her progress. But Elizabeth pressed on, her sister's well-being the beacon that guided her forward. Upon her arrival at Netherfield, Elizabeth's appearance caused quite a stir. She stood in the grand entryway, a vision of dishevelment amidst the opulent surroundings. The Bingley sisters exchanged looks of shock and disdain, their perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate dresses a stark contrast to Elizabeth's wild curls and mud-splattered attire. Mr. Darcy, however, found himself unexpectedly moved by her devotion. His eyes lingered on her flushed cheeks and bright eyes, a new-found respect blooming in his chest. "Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Bingley greeted her warmly, his voice tinged with genuine concern. "You must stay and help nurse your sister back to health." His anxious glances towards the stairs betrayed his worry for Jane. As Elizabeth settled into life at Netherfield, she found herself thrust into a world that was both familiar and foreign. The drawing-room became a battlefield of wit and propriety, with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy engaging in verbal sparring matches that left onlookers both amused and perplexed. Caroline Bingley's voice cut through the air like a silk-wrapped dagger. "I wonder, Miss Eliza," she would say, her eyes narrowing to slits, "do you find much occasion for such vigorous walks in Hertfordshire?" Elizabeth, her eyes sparkling with mischief, would reply with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Indeed, Miss Bingley. One must find ways to invigorate the mind and body, don't you agree?" The tension in the room was palpable, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. As the days passed, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the changing dynamics within the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley's attentions to Jane grew more pronounced with each visit to her sickroom, his face lighting up at the mere mention of her name. His kindness shone like a beacon in the sometimes cold atmosphere of Netherfield, warming Elizabeth's worried heart. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, seemed to be waging an internal battle. His gaze would often linger on Elizabeth, a mixture of admiration and frustration clouding his features. Their conversations were like intricate dances, each step carefully measured, each word weighted with potential meaning. The air in Netherfield grew thick with unspoken tensions and budding attractions. Elizabeth found herself both fascinated and repelled by the complexities of this new social circle. She observed the Bingley sisters' thinly veiled disdain for her family's lower status, their words as sharp as the cut crystal glasses they sipped from. Yet, amidst the social maneuvering, moments of genuine connection emerged. Jane's illness, while uncomfortable for her, had become the catalyst for deeper bonds. As she convalesced, Mr. Bingley's frequent visits to her sickroom only strengthened their growing attachment, his gentle nature and genuine concern winning over not just Jane, but Elizabeth as well. The extended stay at Netherfield served as a crucible, intensifying relationships and revealing true natures. Elizabeth's quick wit and lively mind seemed to both challenge and captivate Darcy, much to Caroline Bingley's evident displeasure. The charged atmosphere crackled with potential, like the air before a thunderstorm. As Jane's health improved and talk of returning home began, a letter arrived at Netherfield. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she recognized her mother's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal, her heart racing as she read the contents. A visitor had arrived at Longbourn, someone whose presence promised to upend the delicate balance of their lives. Elizabeth's mind reeled as she contemplated the implications of Mr. Collins' arrival, wondering how this new player would fit into the intricate dance of relationships that had been set in motion at Netherfield. Mr. Collins, a pompous clergyman, arrived at Longbourn for a visit. As the cousins set to inherit the estate due to the entail that prevented the Bennet sisters from inheriting, he came with a clear purpose in mind. The crisp autumn air nipped at the noses of the Bennet family as they gathered in the drawing-room, their breath visible in small puffs. Anticipation hung thick in the air, like the fog that clung to the windows. The crackle of the fire in the hearth did little to warm the chill that had settled over them all. The door creaked open, and Mr. Collins swept in, his clerical robes rustling with each exaggerated movement. The sisters exchanged quick glances, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of their cousin. He was a short, stocky man with small, beady eyes that darted from one sister to another, assessing them as if they were prized cattle at a fair. "My dear cousins," he began, his voice dripping with false sweetness, "I come to you with the blessing of my esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh." He paused, clearly expecting gasps of awe that never came. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. As Mr. Collins droned on about Lady Catherine's generosity and his own importance, Elizabeth felt a growing unease. It was like a pebble in her shoe, small but impossible to ignore. She caught Jane's eye, noting the slight furrow in her sister's usually serene brow. Mrs. Bennet, ever the puppet master in matters of matrimony, quickly took control of the situation. "Oh, Mr. Collins," she tittered, her fan fluttering like a nervous bird, "our dear Jane is likely to be engaged soon." But Elizabeth would make a fine wife. Elizabeth's heart plummeted, feeling as if it had dropped straight through the floorboards. She found herself the new object of Mr. Collins' attention, his gaze fixed on her with the intensity of a predator eyeing its prey. She suppressed a shudder, forcing a polite smile that felt more like a grimace. Over the next few days, Mr. Collins made himself increasingly ridiculous. His attempts at gallantry were as graceful as a newborn colt, all awkward limbs and misplaced enthusiasm. He shadowed Elizabeth relentlessly, his presence as unwelcome as a sudden downpour on a picnic. One crisp afternoon, as Elizabeth sought refuge in the garden, the scent of late-blooming roses hanging in the air, Mr. Collins cornered her. She felt like a fox trapped by hounds, her back pressed against the rough bark of an old oak tree. "My dear cousin," he began, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster, "I have come to make you an offer of marriage." Elizabeth's world tilted on its axis. The garden spun around her, the colors blurring into a dizzying whirl. She stood, rooted to the spot, as Mr. Collins launched into a long-winded speech about the reasons for marriage. His words washed over her like a tide of unwanted attention, leaving her feeling cold and clammy. When he finally paused for breath, Elizabeth seized her chance. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within, "I am sensible of the honor of your proposals, but I cannot accept them. We would not suit." Mr. Collins blinked, confusion etched on his face like a badly drawn map. "But surely you jest," he sputtered, his composure cracking like thin ice. Elizabeth stood firm, her resolve as unyielding as the oak at her back. "I assure you, sir, I am perfectly serious. I cannot accept your offer." The news of Elizabeth's refusal spread through Longbourn like wildfire. Mrs. Bennet's wails of despair echoed through the halls, her dreams of security evaporating like morning mist. Mr. Bennet, however, stood by his daughter's decision, his quiet support a balm to Elizabeth's frayed nerves. Mr. Collins, still not fully comprehending Elizabeth's refusal, continued to hover about the house like a persistent fly. The incident hung over Longbourn like a storm cloud, highlighting the societal pressures on women to marry for security rather than love. Yet Elizabeth remained steadfast, her determination to marry only for deep affection burning bright like a beacon in the night. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grounds of Longbourn, Elizabeth stood at her bedroom window. The weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders, but she felt a sense of pride in staying true to herself. However, a new worry began to gnaw at her. In the distance, she could see a rider approaching at great speed, kicking up dust in his wake. Something was amiss. Little did she know that this messenger carried news that would shake the foundations of her world once more. A crisp autumn breeze whispered through the trees surrounding Longbourn, carrying with it the bitter news of the Netherfield party's departure. The once lively Bennet household now stood silent, as if the very walls had absorbed the family's disappointment. The air hung heavy with unspoken words and dashed hopes. Jane sat by the window, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the storm of emotions beneath. Her delicate fingers traced invisible patterns on the cold glass, mirroring the intricate dance of fallen leaves outside. Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, now held a distant melancholic glow, as if searching the horizon for a glimpse of returning carriages. The arrival of a letter from Caroline Bingley did little to lift Jane's spirits. As she read, her shoulders seemed to droop further, like a wilting flower denied sunlight. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, betraying the turmoil within. "They have no intention of returning for the winter," Jane said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused, swallowing hard before continuing, "And there's more. It seems Mr. Darcy and his sister Georgiana. Well, there might be an attachment forming there." Elizabeth, watching her sister intently, felt a surge of protective anger. She paced the room, her steps quick and agitated, like a caged tiger. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, a discordant melody accompanying her tumultuous thoughts. "This reeks of manipulation," she muttered, her mind racing with suspicions of the Bingley sisters' interference, and worse, of Mr. Darcy's hand in the matter. The news spread through the house like wildfire, each family member reacting in their own characteristic way. Mrs. Bennet's wails echoed through the corridors, her lamentations a stark contrast to the quiet sorrow of her eldest daughter. "Oh, what a cruel twist of fate," she cried, collapsing dramatically onto a chaise lounge. "To lose such a promising match for our Jane." Mr. Bennet, ensconced in his study, merely raised an eyebrow at the commotion. The smell of old books and pipe tobacco wafted from the room as he opened the door, his dry comment cutting through the air. "Well, I suppose we shall have to soldier on somehow." His words did little to soothe the frayed nerves of his family. Kitty and Lydia, the youngest Bennet sisters, huddled together in a corner, their whispers a mix of disappointment and excitement. "No more grand balls at Netherfield," Lydia pouted, while Kitty nodded in agreement, both mourning the loss of potential adventures and flirtations. Their giggles, once a constant backdrop to the household, now seemed out of place in the somber atmosphere. As days passed, the absence of the Netherfield party left a void in the local community. Gossip swirled like autumn leaves in the wind, with speculation rife about the reasons behind their sudden departure. At every tea party and social gathering, hushed voices debated the future of Jane and Bingley's relationship. The clinking of teacups and rustling of skirts provided a constant undercurrent to the whispered conversations. Jane, ever the optimist, tried to find excuses for Caroline's behavior and Bingley's departure. Perhaps there was an urgent matter in London, she mused one evening, her voice tinged with hope. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the conflict between her words and the sadness in her eyes. "I'm sure Caroline means well, despite how things appear." Elizabeth, unable to contain her frustration, paced the room like a restless spirit. The hem of her dress swished against the floor, a soft counterpoint to her agitated movements. "Oh, Jane," she sighed, her voice a mixture of exasperation and admiration for her sister's unwavering kindness. "Your heart is too good. Can't you see the deceit in their actions?" As weeks turned into months, the Bennet household settled into a quieter routine. The excitement of the Netherfield ball faded like a distant dream, replaced by the steady rhythm of daily life. Jane, though outwardly composed, carried her disappointment like a hidden wound, her smiles not quite reaching her eyes. The sound of her needle-piercing fabric as she sewed became a constant, almost meditative presence in the house. Elizabeth, ever watchful, grew more protective of her sister's feelings. She observed Jane with a mixture of concern and admiration, marveling at her sister's strength in the face of heartbreak. In quiet moments, Elizabeth's thoughts often turned to Mr. Darcy, her resentment towards him growing like a thorny vine around her heart. The crackling of the fire in the hearth seemed to echo her simmering anger. The family settled into a new normal, with Jane silently nursing her disappointment and Elizabeth becoming increasingly vigilant. The days grew shorter, and the chill in the air deepened, mirroring the cooling of once warm hopes. As winter approached, an unexpected buzz of excitement began to ripple through Meryton. Whispers of a militia regiment's imminent arrival reached Longbourn, stirring the younger Bennet sisters from their ennui. Lydia and Kitty's eyes sparkled with renewed interest, their chatter growing more animated by the day. Even Jane seemed to perk up slightly at the prospect of new faces in town. Elizabeth, observing this shift in mood, felt a mix of relief and apprehension. As she gazed out the window one evening, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she couldn't shake the feeling that this new development would bring both opportunity and challenge. Little did she know that the arrival of the militia would set in motion a chain of events that would test the Bennet family in ways they could never have imagined. The arrival of a militia regiment in Meryton sent a ripple of excitement through the town. For the younger Bennet sisters, it brought a whirlwind of new social opportunities and the promise of adventure. The air buzzed with anticipation as red-coated officers filled the streets, their polished buttons gleaming in the sunlight. Kitty and Lydia Bennet could hardly contain their glee, giggling and whispering behind gloved hands as they strolled through the town square. Among the sea of uniforms, one man stood out like a beacon. George Wickham, with his easy smile and twinkling eyes, drew admiring glances wherever he went. Elizabeth Bennet found herself inexplicably drawn to him, his warm demeanor a refreshing contrast to the aloof Mr. Darcy she had encountered before. At a local gathering, the cheerful atmosphere suddenly chilled. Elizabeth watched, intrigued, as Wickham and Darcy locked eyes across the room. The tension between them was palpable, like storm clouds gathering on a sunny day. Darcy's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening, while Wickham's smile faltered for just a moment before regaining its charm. Later, in a quiet corner away from the bustle of the party, Wickham confided in Elizabeth. His voice low and tinged with sadness, he spun a tale of past injustices. "Mr. Darcy," he said, his eyes downcast, "has done me great wrong. His father promised me a valuable living, but Darcy, out of jealousy and pride, snatched it away." Elizabeth listened, her heart swelling with sympathy. Wickham's story fit so neatly with her own poor opinion of Darcy that she never thought to question it. She was captivated, seeing Wickham through a haze of admiration that blinded her to any potential flaws in his character or story. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's world was about to be shaken by news from an unexpected quarter. Her dear friend Charlotte Lucas, at the age of 27 and facing the specter of spinsterhood, made a decision that left Elizabeth reeling. "Lizzie," Charlotte said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a hint of apprehension, "I have accepted Mr. Collins's proposal of marriage." Elizabeth felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "But Charlotte," she exclaimed, her voice a mixture of shock and dismay, "surely you cannot mean to accept Mr. Collins? What of love, of companionship?" Charlotte's reply was as level-headed as it was heartbreaking. "My dear Lizzie," she said, her eyes meeting Elizabeth's with a steady gaze, "I am not romantic, you know. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." Elizabeth struggled to reconcile her friend's choice with her own ideals of marriage. It was as if she and Charlotte were suddenly speaking different languages, their understanding of life and love diverging like two paths in a wood. The news of Charlotte's engagement spread through the community like wildfire, eliciting a range of reactions. None was more dramatic than that of Mrs. Bennet, who received the news as if it were a personal affront. "Oh, Mr. Bennet," she wailed, her handkerchief fluttering like a distress signal. "To think that Charlotte Lucas should be mistress of Hunsford when it might have been one of our own girls. And all because Elizabeth would not have him." Mr. Collins returned to Longbourn briefly to celebrate his engagement, his manner a curious mixture of triumph and obsequiousness. He strutted about like a peacock, his chest puffed out with pride, while simultaneously bowing and scraping to Lady Catherine de Bourgh in absentia. Throughout these tumultuous events, Wickham remained a bright spot in Elizabeth's social circle. His presence was like a warm hearth on a cold day, drawing people in with its comfort and cheer. Elizabeth found herself particularly susceptible to his charms, her heart quickening whenever he was near. However, the fickle winds of fortune and finance soon shifted Wickham's attention. A Miss King, newly come into an inheritance, suddenly became the object of his attentions. Elizabeth watched this development with a twinge of disappointment, but found to her surprise that the pain was not as deep as she might have expected. It was as if Wickham were a beautiful butterfly that had briefly alighted on her hand before fluttering away, lovely to behold, but ultimately transient. As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself navigating a social landscape that seemed to shift like quicksand beneath her feet. The simple certainties of her youth were giving way to the complex realities of adult life, where love and pragmatism often stood at odds. She watched as those around her made choices that would shape their futures, all the while wondering what path her own heart would lead her down. As winter gave way to spring, Elizabeth received an invitation that would set her on a new path. Her aunt and uncle Gardiner proposed a trip to Hunsford, where she could visit the newly married Charlotte. As she packed her trunk, her mind swirled with thoughts of what lay ahead. Little did she know that this journey would lead her to confront her own prejudices and challenge everything she thought she knew about love and character. Elizabeth Bennet's heart fluttered with anticipation as she embarked on her journey to Hunsford. She was eager to visit her newly married friend Charlotte and her husband, Mr. Collins. The carriage wheels clattered against the rough country road, jostling Elizabeth as she gazed out the window. Rolling hills of emerald and gold stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with grazing sheep and the occasional thatched roof cottage. The fresh scent of spring flowers wafted through the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil. As the miles passed, Elizabeth's mind wandered to Charlotte's new life. How different it must be from the lively chaos of Longbourn. She pictured her practical friend navigating the quiet halls of a parsonage, her days filled with parish duties and the company of Mr. Collins. A small frown creased Elizabeth's brow as she considered the stark contrast between Charlotte's chosen path and her own dreams of a love match. Upon arrival, Elizabeth found herself swept into a whirlwind of introductions. The air hummed with nervous energy as Mr. Collins ushered her from one acquaintance to another, his voice a constant drone of obsequious pleasantries. But it was the introduction to Lady Catherine de Bourgh that truly set Elizabeth's nerves on edge. Lady Catherine stood like a statue carved from ice, her piercing gaze seeming to dissect Elizabeth's very being. The grand drawing-room of Rosings Park suddenly felt stifling, the opulent furnishings a stark reminder of the social gulf between them. When Lady Catherine spoke, her voice cut through the air like a knife's edge. "So, you are Miss Elizabeth Bennet," she declared, her tone dripping with disdain. "I trust you understand the honor of being invited to Rosings Park." Elizabeth's wit itched to respond, a clever retort dancing on the tip of her tongue. But she caught sight of Charlotte's pleading eyes and swallowed her words, offering instead a polite curtsy. "Indeed, your ladyship. I am most grateful for your hospitality." As the days passed, Elizabeth observed the delicate dance of the Collins household with growing fascination. Charlotte moved through her new life with quiet efficiency, like a skilled puppeteer managing the strings of her household. Mr. Collins, ever the sycophant, practically genuflected at the mention of Lady Catherine's name, his excessive deference almost painful to witness. Rosings Park loomed large over the village, its grand facade a constant reminder of Lady Catherine's influence. Elizabeth found herself frequently within its opulent halls, each visit feeling less like an invitation and more like a royal summons. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air, suffocating in its intensity. Just as Elizabeth was settling into the rhythm of life at Hunsford, fate threw her a curveball. The arrival of Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, sent ripples through the quiet parish. The moment Darcy's eyes met Elizabeth's, the air crackled with unspoken tension, a storm of conflicting emotions brewing between them. Colonel Fitzwilliam proved to be a welcome distraction, his amiable nature a stark contrast to Darcy's brooding silence. Elizabeth found herself drawn to the Colonel's company, their conversations ranging from literature to music, punctuated by laughter that echoed through the gardens of Rosings. It was during one such walk that Elizabeth's world tilted on its axis. The Colonel, unaware of the weight of his words, mentioned Darcy's recent intervention in a friend's imprudent marriage. Elizabeth's heart clenched, her mind immediately leaping to Jane and Bingley. The embers of her anger towards Darcy, which had been slowly dying, roared back to life with a vengeance. Meanwhile, Darcy found himself increasingly drawn to Elizabeth, like a moth to a flame. Their debates crackled with intellectual energy, their wit matching stride for stride like two skilled fencers. Yet beneath the surface, a current of unresolved tension simmered, threatening to boil over at any moment. Lady Catherine's presence cast a long shadow over their interactions, her expectations for Darcy to marry her daughter, and hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Elizabeth watched the interplay between Darcy and his aunt with keen interest, noting the flashes of resistance in his otherwise respectful demeanor. As the visit drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself more conflicted than ever. Her preconceptions about Darcy's pride and interference in others' lives had been both challenged and reinforced, leaving her mind in a whirl of confusion. The world seemed to have expanded, revealing new complexities she had never before considered. The day of departure arrived, and as Elizabeth bid farewell to Charlotte and the others, a sense of unfinished business nagged at her. She climbed into the waiting carriage, her mind a tumult of unresolved questions and conflicting emotions. As the horses began to move, pulling her away from Hunsford and back towards Longbourn, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Just as the carriage rounded the bend, a commotion erupted behind them. Elizabeth turned, her heart racing, to see a figure on horseback galloping towards them at breakneck speed. The tranquility of the parsonage was about to be shattered by an unexpected visitor. The tranquility of the parsonage was shattered by an unexpected visitor. Mr. Darcy's sudden arrival set the stage for a momentous encounter that would forever alter the course of his relationship with Elizabeth. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she watched Mr. Darcy's tall figure enter the room, his presence filling the space with an almost palpable tension. The soft tick of the mantel clock seemed to grow louder in the silence, punctuated only by the rustle of Elizabeth's skirts as she shifted nervously. Mr. Darcy's usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain, his eyes betraying a mix of determination and vulnerability. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense, like a storm barely contained. "Miss Bennet, I can bear it no longer. These past months have been a torment." His words tumbled out, gaining momentum like a river breaking through a dam. "I love you. Most ardently. Please do me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Elizabeth stood frozen, her mind reeling as if struck by a physical blow. As Mr. Darcy continued, His passionate words were marred by references to her family's social standing and what he perceived as their improper behavior. His proposal, though heartfelt, struck a discordant chord within her. Anger flared in Elizabeth's chest, hot and bright as a newly stoked fire. Her eyes flashed as she responded, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Sir, I appreciate the struggle you have been through, and I am sorry to have caused you pain. Believe me, it was unconsciously done." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing, her words sharp as newly forged steel. "I cannot accept your offer. Your actions towards my sister Jane and Mr. Wickham, not to mention your apparent arrogance, make it impossible for me to even consider such a proposition." The room crackled with tension as their conversation grew heated. Words flew back and forth like arrows in battle, each finding their mark with unerring accuracy. Mr. Darcy's face, usually an impassive mask, now showed a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, hurt, and indignation warring for dominance. As the full weight of Elizabeth's refusal and accusation sank in, Mr. Darcy's shoulders slumped, as if physically struck. Without another word, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Elizabeth sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly weak. The encounter left her feeling drained, like a storm-tossed ship finally finding harbor. She barely slept that night, her mind replaying the scene over and over, analyzing every word, every gesture. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Elizabeth's heart. As she walked in the garden, trying to clear her head, the crisp morning air filled with the scent of blooming flowers, she spotted Mr. Darcy approaching. Her breath caught in her throat, but he merely handed her a letter before turning away, his face a study in controlled anguish. With trembling hands, Elizabeth broke the seal and began to read. The letter was like a key, unlocking secrets and shedding light on misunderstandings. Mr. Darcy explained his actions regarding Mr. Wickham, revealing a shocking tale of attempted elopement with his young sister Georgiana. The Wickham she thought she knew crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide of truth. Regarding Jane and Mr. Bingley, Darcy admitted to discouraging the match, believing Jane's affections to be insincere due to her reserved nature. He also expressed concerns about her family's behavior, his words a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths. As she read and reread the letter, Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her carefully constructed judgments of both Darcy and Wickham began to crumble. Like a blind person's suddenly granted sight, she saw her own prejudices and hasty conclusions in stark relief. Shame and regret washed over her like a cold wave. She had been so quick to judge, so certain in her beliefs. Now, faced with the truth, she realized the danger of first impressions and the folly of clinging to prejudices. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Elizabeth sat on a garden bench, the letter clutched in her hand. She felt as if she were standing at a crossroads, the path ahead unclear but full of possibility. This moment, this letter, had changed everything. It was a turning point, not just in her understanding of Darcy and Wickham, but in her understanding of herself. The letter served as a catalyst, sparking a profound change in Elizabeth's perception. As she struggled with her newfound insights, she realized that this was just the beginning of a journey of self-reflection and growth that would reshape her world in ways she could not yet imagine. Weeks passed, and Elizabeth found herself embarking on a tour of Derbyshire with her aunt and uncle, the gardeners. As their carriage rolled through the lush countryside, Elizabeth's mind wandered to thoughts of Mr. Darcy. Little did she know that fate was about to intervene, as their journey took an unexpected turn. The carriage slowed, and Elizabeth's heart leapt into her throat as she realized they were approaching a grand estate. Her aunt's excited whisper confirmed her suspicions. "Look, Lizzie. It's Pemberley." Elizabeth embarked on a tour of Derbyshire with her aunt and uncle, the gardeners. Their journey took an unexpected turn as they found themselves near Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's grand estate. The rolling hills of Derbyshire stretched out before them, a patchwork of emerald fields and ancient woodlands. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, a stark contrast to the stuffy London air Elizabeth had left behind. As their carriage crested a hill, Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. There, nestled in the valley below, stood Pemberley. "Lizzie dear," her aunt called, breaking through her reverie. "Shall we visit Pemberley? I've heard it's quite magnificent." Elizabeth's heart raced, her palms suddenly damp. The thought of seeing Mr. Darcy's home both thrilled and terrified her. "I'm not sure," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her uncle, sensing her hesitation, chimed in, "The family's away, Lizzie. We'd only be touring the grounds." With a deep breath that seemed to steady her very soul, Elizabeth nodded. "Very well, let's go." As they approached, Pemberley revealed itself like a jewel nestled in the landscape. The grand house, with its weathered stone facade and gleaming windows, took Elizabeth's breath away. Manicured gardens gave way to wild, untamed woods, a perfect balance of nature and cultivation. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they made their way to the entrance, the sound echoing in the still summer air. They were greeted by Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, whose warm smile put Elizabeth at ease. As they toured the house, Mrs. Reynolds spoke of Mr. Darcy with such genuine affection that Elizabeth found herself questioning her own judgments. "He's the best master who ever lived," Mrs. Reynolds declared, her eyes shining. "So kind to the poor, and never a cross word to anyone." Elizabeth's mind whirled. This Darcy sounded nothing like the proud, disdainful man she thought she knew. She found herself lingering in each room, drinking in the details of Darcy's life. The scent of leather-bound books in his study, the faint echo of music in the grand hall, each discovery painted a picture of a man far more complex than she had imagined. In his study, she noticed a well-worn book of poetry, its pages dog-eared and marked. Her fingers itched to open it, to see which verses had captured his attention. In the music room, sheet music lay scattered as if recently played, a haunting melody still hanging in the air. As they stepped out onto the grounds, the summer sun warmed Elizabeth's face. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to imagine what it might be like to call this place home. The thought both exhilarated and unsettled her, like standing at the edge of a great precipice. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the path ahead. Elizabeth's heart leapt to her throat, her pulse quickening like a frightened bird. It was Mr. Darcy himself, returned unexpectedly. Time seemed to stand still as their eyes met. Elizabeth braced herself for his usual haughty demeanor, but to her astonishment, his face broke into a warm smile that transformed his features. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice softer than she remembered, like velvet against her skin. What a pleasant surprise. What followed was a whirlwind of introductions and invitations. Darcy, to Elizabeth's amazement, was the picture of graciousness. He invited her uncle to fish on the grounds and insisted on introducing Elizabeth to his sister Georgiana. Georgiana proved to be nothing like the haughty beauty Elizabeth had imagined. Instead, she was a shy, sweet girl who looked at her brother with obvious adoration. Her delicate features and gentle manner reminded Elizabeth of a young fawn, timid yet curious. As the day wore on, Elizabeth found herself in a state of constant surprise. Darcy's kindness to her aunt and uncle, despite their lower social status, touched her deeply. She watched him laugh with her uncle over fishing techniques and discuss music with her aunt, his usual reserve melting away like spring snow. With each passing hour, Elizabeth felt her heart softening. The Darcy she saw before her was generous, kind, and free from the pride she had once despised. She caught herself stealing glances at him, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands as he helped Georgiana with her shawl. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over Pemberley, Elizabeth found herself lingering, reluctant to leave. She stood at the edge of a flower garden, lost in thought, the sweet scent of roses enveloping her. "Miss Bennet." Darcy's voice startled her. He stood beside her, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes seemed to hold a warmth she had never noticed before. "I hope you've enjoyed your visit." Elizabeth met his gaze, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. "I have very much," she said softly. "Thank you for your hospitality." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken words and possibilities. Elizabeth found herself confused by her changing feelings, realizing that her opinion of Darcy had undergone a significant transformation. As she bid farewell to Pemberley and its master, Elizabeth knew that something fundamental had shifted. The future, once so clear, now seemed full of new and exciting possibilities. As their carriage pulled away from Pemberley, Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She stole one last glance at the grand estate, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. In that moment, a realization struck her with the force of a lightning bolt. Her feelings for Mr. Darcy were changing, evolving into something she had never expected. But what did it mean? And more importantly, what would she do about it? Elizabeth's newfound appreciation for Mr. Darcy was blossoming like a delicate spring flower. However, this tender sentiment was about to be abruptly shattered by shocking news from home. The morning air was crisp and full of promise as Elizabeth strolled through the gardens of Pemberley. Her mind wandered to thoughts of Mr. Darcy, his kindness, and the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses, mirroring the sweetness of her budding feelings. Suddenly, a servant appeared, breathless and wide-eyed, clutching a letter. "Miss Bennet, an urgent message for you." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she took the crumpled envelope. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, the paper rough against her skin. As she read, the world around her seemed to dim, the birdsong fading to a distant echo. Lydia, her youngest sister, had eloped with George Wickham. The words blurred before her eyes, each one a hammer blow to her composure. Lydia, barely 16 and as wild as an untamed filly, had thrown herself into the arms of a man with a character as unstable as quicksand. The family's reputation, already precarious, now teetered on the brink of ruin. Elizabeth's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of worry and regret. She rushed to her room, hands shaking as she hastily packed her belongings. The cheerful patterns of her dresses now seemed to mock her distress. As she prepared to leave, fate intervened. Mr. Darcy appeared in the hallway, his tall figure casting a shadow across the polished floor. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the full weight of her family's predicament crashed upon her anew. "Mr. Darcy," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm afraid I must return home immediately. My sister." The words caught in her throat, but Darcy's concerned gaze encouraged her to continue. "Lydia has run away with Mr. Wickham." Shock flashed across Darcy's face, mirroring her own turmoil. Little did Elizabeth know that her words would set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of their lives. The journey back to Longbourn felt interminable. Each turn of the carriage wheels seemed to echo Elizabeth's racing heartbeat. The once pleasant countryside now appeared gloomy and foreboding, as if nature itself sympathized with her plight. Upon arrival, Elizabeth found her home transformed into a tableau of despair. The usually welcoming facade of Longbourn now loomed ominously, its windows dark with unspoken shame. Inside, chaos reigned. Mrs. Bennet's wails echoed through the house like a mournful ghost. "Oh, my poor Lydia! My poor nerves! We are ruined, all ruined." Her mother lay sprawled dramatically across her bed, a damp cloth on her forehead, her face pale and drawn. Mr. Bennet, typically found in his library with a book and a sardonic quip, was conspicuously absent. His weathered face set with grim determination, he had departed for London to search for the wayward couple. The lack of his dry humor left a palpable void in the household. Jane, sweet Jane, tried valiantly to maintain order amidst the mayhem. Her gentle nature, usually a balm to frayed nerves, now seemed stretched to its limits. Elizabeth watched as her sister moved from room to room, soothing their mother, calming their younger sisters, her own fears hidden behind a mask of serene efficiency. Beyond the walls of Longbourn, the scandal spread like wildfire. Elizabeth felt the weight of judgmental stares whenever she ventured into the village. Whispers followed her like persistent shadows, each murmur a dagger to her already wounded pride. Faces that were once friendly now wore masks of pity and barely concealed glee at the family's misfortune. Unbeknownst to the beleaguered Bennets, Mr. Darcy had sprung into action. Driven by a potent mixture of love for Elizabeth and a gnawing sense of responsibility for not exposing Wickham's true nature earlier, he set off for London like a man possessed. The bustling streets of the city, usually a maze of opportunity and excitement, now felt like a labyrinth hiding the key to salvaging the Bennet family's honor. Darcy's search led him through London's seedy underbelly, a world far removed from his usual refined circles. Days of relentless pursuit finally bore fruit. Darcy located the errant couple in a dingy boarding house, the peeling wallpaper and musty air a far cry from the romantic elopement Lydia had undoubtedly envisioned. Wickham, charming as ever but with a calculating glint in his eye, showed no inclination towards making an honest woman of Lydia. The girl herself, oblivious to the gravity of her situation, prattled on about the excitement of her adventure. With the skill of a seasoned negotiator and the determination of a man on a mission, Darcy set about untangling the mess. Money changed hands, promises were extracted, and threats were delicately veiled. In the end, Wickham agreed to marry Lydia, more out of self-interest than any sense of duty or affection. To protect Elizabeth's feelings and his own privacy, Darcy orchestrated a clever ruse. He arranged for Mr. Gardiner to take credit for resolving the situation, a plan that would spare the Bennets further embarrassment while allowing him to remain in the shadows. When news of the resolution reached Longbourn, it was like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Mrs. Bennet's lamentations turned to jubilant cries of relief, her recovery as swift as her descent into hysterics. Mr. Bennet's return brought a semblance of normalcy back to the household, his dry wit a welcome balm to frayed nerves. The prodigal couple's return as newlyweds was met with a mixture of relief and resigned acceptance. Lydia, still caught up in the romance of her great love story, seemed oblivious to the turmoil she had caused. Her giggles and excited chatter grated on Elizabeth's nerves like sandpaper. Wickham, for his part, maintained his facade of charm, though those who knew him best could detect the faint air of resentment beneath his easy smile. As life at Longbourn began to find its new rhythm, Elizabeth received a letter from Mrs. Gardiner. The sight of the familiar handwriting sent a flutter through her stomach, a premonition of change hanging in the air. With trembling fingers, Elizabeth unfolded the letter and began to read. As Mrs. Gardiner's words revealed the true extent of Mr. Darcy's involvement in saving Lydia and the family's reputation, Elizabeth felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Each sentence peeled away another layer of her preconceptions about the man she had once so thoroughly misjudged. The magnitude of Darcy's actions, undertaken despite their previous misunderstandings and with no expectation of recognition or reward, struck Elizabeth to her very core. In that moment, as she clutched the letter to her chest, Elizabeth realized that her feelings for Mr. Darcy had undergone a profound transformation. What had begun as a newfound appreciation now blossomed into something deeper, richer, and infinitely more complex. As Elizabeth sat by the window, her mind awhirl with newfound emotions, a distant sound caught her attention. The crunch of gravel under carriage wheels broke the stillness of the afternoon. Her heart leapt into her throat as she recognized the elegant conveyance rolling up the drive. Could it be? The wheels of Mr. Bingley's carriage drew ever closer to Netherfield Park, and with them, the promise of new beginnings and unspoken hopes. The wheels of Mr. Bingley's carriage crunched on the gravel drive as it rolled into Netherfield Park. His unexpected return sent ripples of excitement through the nearby town of Meryton. The crisp autumn air carried whispers of hope, reigniting dreams of a possible union between the amiable gentleman and the eldest Bennet daughter, Jane. At Longbourn, the Bennet household buzzed with anticipation. Mrs. Bennet fluttered about like a hummingbird, her usual complaints about her nerves transformed into excited chatter. The very walls seemed to vibrate with her enthusiasm as she darted from room to room, straightening cushions and adjusting flower arrangements. Jane, ever the picture of serenity, sat by the window, her fingers absently tracing the delicate embroidery on her handkerchief. Though her face remained calm, her eyes betrayed a glimmer of hope, like sunlight peeking through clouds after a long rain. She inhaled deeply, the scent of late-blooming roses drifting in from the garden, a reminder of new beginnings. Elizabeth observed the unfolding scene with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Her heart swelled with happiness for Jane, yet a nagging curiosity about Mr. Darcy's possible involvement in Bingley's return tugged at her thoughts. She paced the drawing room, her skirts swishing softly against the carpet, her mind a whirlwind of questions and possibilities. As the days grew shorter and the leaves turned to gold and crimson, Bingley's visits to Longbourn became as regular as the changing seasons. His attentions to Jane were unmistakable, his eyes lighting up like stars whenever she entered the room. Even Mr. Bennet emerged from his sanctuary in the library, drawn by the palpable excitement that hung in the air like the sweet scent of ripening apples. Then, on a frosty morning when delicate ice patterns adorned the window panes, Bingley proposed to Jane. Her joyful acceptance broke through the winter chill like the first warm ray of spring sunshine. The couple's happiness radiated throughout Longbourn, melting even the frostiest of hearts. Mrs. Bennet's reaction was nothing short of explosive. Her cries of joy echoed through the house, startling the birds from the eaves. She twirled about the room, her skirts billowing, already envisioning the fine carriages and grand parties that surely awaited Jane in her new life. But as the family reveled in this joyous occasion, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Rumors of an attachment between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy had reached the formidable Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, she descended upon Longbourn, her arrival as sudden and unwelcome as a summer squall. The drawing room at Longbourn transformed into a battlefield. Lady Catherine's words cut through the air like icy daggers as she demanded Elizabeth promise never to enter into an engagement with Darcy. She brandished her aristocratic lineage like a shield, citing a long-standing plan for Darcy to marry her own daughter, and Elizabeth stood her ground, her spine straightening like a young oak tree facing a gale. Despite the uncertainty swirling in her heart about Darcy's current feelings, she refused to make such a promise. Her voice remained steady, a counterpoint to Lady Catherine's shrill demands. "I will not make any promise of the kind," Elizabeth declared, her words ringing clear in the tense silence. "And I must beg not to be importuned any further on the subject." The confrontation crackled with tension, each woman a force of nature in her own right. With every barb Lady Catherine threw, Elizabeth's resolve strengthened. She found reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, impressing even herself with her firmness. As Lady Catherine swept out of Longbourn in a cloud of indignation, the air seemed to clear, as if a storm had passed. Her angry departure had inadvertently revealed a crucial piece of information: Darcy's affections for Elizabeth might not have changed after all. This realization bloomed in Elizabeth's heart like a flower unfurling its petals after a long winter. The confrontation had not only clarified her own feelings for Darcy but had also given her the courage to face them head-on. As the dust settled from Lady Catherine's visit, Elizabeth found herself standing on the precipice of a new understanding, both of herself and of the man she had once so thoroughly misjudged. Twilight fell over Longbourn, casting long shadows across the garden. Elizabeth stood at the window, her heart full of newfound hope and determination. The cool glass beneath her fingertips grounded her as her mind raced with possibilities. For the first time, she felt truly ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. As night descended, a distant sound of hoofbeats broke the evening stillness. Elizabeth's heart leaped into her throat as she strained to see through the gathering darkness. Could it be? The rhythmic clop of horses' hooves grew louder, and a familiar silhouette emerged from the shadows. Mr. Darcy had returned to Longbourn. Mr. Darcy made his return to Longbourn, this time with his friend Mr. Bingley by his side. The change in his demeanour towards Elizabeth was unmistakable, with a new-found warmth radiating from his gaze whenever their eyes met. The crisp autumn air swirled around them, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the promise of new beginnings. Elizabeth's heart fluttered with anticipation as she and Darcy found themselves alone during a walk through the grounds. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of expectation, the rustling leaves beneath their feet providing a gentle soundtrack to their momentous encounter. Darcy, emboldened by Elizabeth's response to Lady Catherine's meddling, took a deep breath. The cool air filled his lungs, steadying his nerves as he prepared to lay his heart bare once more. His words, once proud and assuming, now flowed with humility and genuine affection. "My dearest, loveliest Elizabeth," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I find myself once again in the position of asking for your hand. But this time, I do so with a heart that has learned and grown, shaped by your influence and my own reflection." Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she listened, her own feelings having undergone a profound transformation. The world seemed to hold its breath as she processed his words, the gentle breeze caressing her face as if urging her to speak. With a smile that lit up her eyes like stars in the night sky, she accepted his proposal, her voice filled with joy and certainty. "Mr. Darcy," she replied, her words warm and full of emotion, "I would be honored to become your wife." The tension that had long existed between them melted away like morning mist in the sun. They walked on, their steps in perfect sync, unraveling the tangled web of their past misunderstandings. Elizabeth's gratitude for Darcy's intervention in Lydia's scandalous affair poured forth, while Darcy acknowledged how Elizabeth's initial rejection had been a necessary catalyst for his personal growth. Their conversation flowed like a gentle stream, each word bringing them closer together, bridging the gap that had once seemed insurmountable. With their hearts light and spirits high, they agreed to share their joyous news with their families. The Bennet household, usually a cacophony of activity, fell into an unusual hush as Elizabeth and Darcy made their announcement. Mr. Bennet, upon hearing of their engagement, raised an eyebrow in surprise. His initial skepticism was evident in the furrow of his brow, but it softened as Elizabeth earnestly assured him of her love for Darcy. Her words were like a key, unlocking her father's understanding and blessing. Mrs. Bennet's reaction was a whirlwind of emotions, her exclamations of delight echoing through the house like a symphony of joy. Her previous dislike of Darcy evaporated like dew in the morning sun, replaced by unbridled excitement at the prospect of such an advantageous match. "Oh, my dear Lizzie," she cried, her hands fluttering like excited birds. "To think you will be mistress of Pemberley. What jewels, what carriages you shall have." News of Elizabeth and Darcy's engagement spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, igniting a flurry of gossip and speculation. It was as if a pebble had been dropped in a still pond, sending ripples of excitement in every direction. The once quiet lanes of Meryton buzzed with animated conversations, each retelling of the story more embellished than the last. In the midst of this commotion, Jane and Elizabeth found moments of quiet sisterly communion. They shared their happiness, their words intertwining like the branches of two trees growing side by side. "Oh, Lizzie," Jane said, her eyes shining with happiness, "I always knew Mr. Darcy was a good man at heart. And now, to think we shall both be married to the men we love." As preparations for the double wedding of Jane and Bingley alongside Elizabeth and Darcy began, the Bennet household buzzed with activity. It was like watching a garden come to life in spring, with hopes and dreams blossoming at every turn. The air was filled with the rustle of fabric as dresses were fitted, the scratch of pens as invitations were written, and the constant chatter of excited voices planning for the future. Jane and Bingley, their love a gentle and steady flame, made plans to purchase an estate near Pemberley. The thought of the two couples living in close proximity filled Elizabeth with warmth, like sunshine on her skin. She could already imagine the joy of future visits, of children playing together on sprawling lawns, of shared laughter and enduring friendship. As the wedding day approached, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet faced the impending departure of their two eldest daughters with mixed emotions. Mrs. Bennet reveled in the prestige of their marriages, her pride swelling like a peacock's plumage. Mr. Bennet, while happy for his daughters, looked forward to the increased tranquility in his household, anticipating the peace like a weary traveler longing for home. The day of the double wedding dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself was celebrating the unions. The church bells rang out joyously, their peals echoing across the countryside. Elizabeth, resplendent in her wedding gown, felt a sense of completeness as she walked down the aisle towards Darcy. His eyes, filled with love and admiration, never left hers as they exchanged their vows. As the newlyweds left the church, showered with flower petals and well wishes, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of their future stretching out before them. It was a future filled with love, understanding and mutual respect, a partnership of equals. She squeezed Darcy's hand, feeling the strength of his grip in return, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And so, as the carriage bore them away towards their new life, Elizabeth looked back at the figures of her family growing smaller in the distance. She felt a bittersweet pang in her heart, knowing that one chapter of her life was closing. But as she turned to look at Darcy, his face alight with happiness, she knew that an even more exciting chapter was just beginning. The road ahead was open, full of promise and possibility, ready for them to write their own story of love and companionship.